What's up, squad? This is Brandon from the Bantu Sun. Thank you so much for joining me today. So, President Trump has done something that is very Trumpist. And what I mean by that is he took action because he valued action over foresight into the outcome of a situation or the insight of what can the possible outcomes. And this is exactly what has happened with the ouster of President Nicolas Maduro of Venezuela. So Nicolas Maduro has been captured by US forces and is currently in the United States. Now, typically, what you would see in the past when a country take over, and you can tell this is really shows the I don't want to say lack of experience, but the lack of expertise of a President Trump in this regard, because you would not see something similar happen, I think, in a more bureaucratic or I would say institutional regime such as the Bidens or the Clintons or the Bushes for that matter. This is very much of a renegade operation she running with Venezuela. They went in, they ousted, and usually there's a way to secure the power after a coup or a revolution. There has to be a way to secure the power. And the reason why is because you've done all this work, you overthrew the government, and now things have to operate in accordance with your term. With President Trump's administration, they just have not done that. They went in, they took out President Nicolas Maduro, and they left his infrastructure in place. Now, you can say this is a new way of doing things, and they discovered a blitzkrieg sort of for as far as a coup, or you can say this was done sloppily. Time will reveal this fact. But in leaving this administration in place, up to the VP herself, VP Delcy Rodriguez, who currently is acting as interim president, Nicolas Maduro infrastructure is still in place, which is very odd considering this man is believed to be running a criminal enterprise. So you would imagine that he would have his lieutenants in top positions of government office. So wouldn't they be just as guilty or have the ability to be indicted on those charges as well? So what we have here is the head has been removed, but the body is still alive and functioning. And who knows? Supposedly, in an interview, President Trump said Secretary of State Marco Rubio has talked to the VP, and the VP assured them that she was on board with U.S. Plans. And President Trump obviously stated she really doesn't have much of a choice, but she stated she was on board but followed up shortly after with a televised speech to the population of Venezuela saying that President Maduro was the rightful president and he had been kidnapped and demanded that the U.S. return him back to his office, which defeats the whole purpose of what just happened. So there's a lot of confusion on the ground right now. I know President Trump is trying to make this as clean as possible, and he's trying to keep U.S. troops off the ground for numerous reasons. And I think they figured if they can go in, take out Maduro, obviously they didn't expect he have as much support as he probably did, which is why his regime didn't immediately topple. People didn't run into the streets, looting, destroying things, trying to storm government buildings, as you see in some instances where an unpopular leader falls, his his Maduro's country is still operating status quo. So I don't know if the current administration is going to use intimidation to try to push their agenda and make threats. Say, look, we came here, we took your leaders out, we'll do it again, or if they're going to try to lay a framework and force an election in Colombia with U.S. oversight, for the United States can ensure that they did all this work to get the outcomes that they were expecting to get. So, from my end, it's really two things that I'm looking at as far as the next steps. Obviously, you have this Game of Thrones that needs to work itself out, but one, the Cuban relations with Venezuela. I always said if it's two friends you don't want to have in this world is Cuba and Iran. Because although they purport to be America's biggest enemies, they are probably I would say, some of their biggest enablers. If you don't believe me, nobody falls like enemies of the United States that align with Iran and Cuba. And if you don't believe me, you can ask President Bashar al-Assad. And now you can ask, unfortunately, the deceased former President Hugo Chavez, who relied much on Cuba for his health. And then Nicolas Maduro, president of Venezuela, who basically a lot of his intelligence and security were linked to the Cubans. And when you see how easily he was sequestered, how easily he was ousted from power in Venezuela, you have to ask, why did he surround himself with Cubans? What made them so valuable in Venezuela where he couldn't even trust his own people in Venezuela? So this is something that I think a conversation is going to have. So I'm going to do a lot more digging and diving and understanding this Cuban Venezuela relationship. I think it's a lot more than meets the eye in this relationship, but really understanding, why were the Cubans so involved in Venezuela? How exactly did Maduro become so vulnerable? And how did he not even trust his own Venezuelans? Now I can understand he's a person that stole the elections, but as you see, even without Maduro, the regime itself has not fell down. There's no mob in the streets calling for immediate elections. Now, of course, there are going to be mixed emotions, but you kind of got to take that in stride, because a lot of the people that's going to not like Maduro, especially overseas, are going to be people that left Venezuela because of Maduro. And it take precedent many points in history. If you see Miami Cubans, they have visceral, antagonistic things to say about the current Cuban government. I've met Persians, the Persians that left before the overthrow of the Shah. I mean, left after the overthrow of the Shah. They have nothing good to say about Ayatollah Iran. So when people leave, of course, they're not going to say good things about the government they left, because they left in protest of those governments. What we need to be looking at is how the people inside of Venezuela are reacting. And what I think is probably one of the more dangerous aspects is, the longer this goes, is the possibility that it can create a rise in nationalism in Latin America to some degree. President Trump has already been in contest with Colombia because their president and him having a relationship is not on the best terms. And now took a leader. They really don't have anybody to plug that space right now. And it's only a matter of time before there's a vacuum cleaner. Who's going to rise? It's a vacuum cleaner. It's going to create a vacuum. And it's only a matter of time before somebody fills that vacuum. And who is going to arise? And that's the dangerous thing. One thing about Latin America that I found very interesting, and I think this has a lot to do with their founders, these conquistador founders, and the way Latin America was kind of built. There hasn't really been a strong, regardless of the cultural familiarity, the common roots of this region, the same religion. There hasn't been a strong nationalism, as you will see with the rise of a Germany in the 19th century, right? You're seeing more commonality between the elites of these countries with each other than you are seeing with the elites of the country with the working class of the country, or the less well off. You see this contrast where the elites are more concerned about the working class or the less well off in their own country than they are a threat from neighboring countries. It reminds me of when I was younger. I used to be a wrestling fan. Still I'm a fan. I just don't watch it to that degree. But when I was younger, wrestling, for those that didn't know, WWF, sports entertainment, it was great fun when I was younger. And one of the premier promotions, of course, was WWF. And it was interesting now because they come up with a story about how WWF came to rose to prominence, and now it's called the WWE. And it's a very successful business. But the model initially started off with the owner, Vince McMahon, the son of the owner, the head promoter. He bought the promotion off of his father. And the way that the wrestling world operated at this time is they had a territorial system. There was fiefdoms, and different promoters operated in different fiefdoms. And you don't encroach on other promoters' fiefdoms or their territories. And what Vince McMahon did that was so revolutionary is he bypassed all that, went over because the promoters are happy, right? They're fat cats, just like elites in these countries, like in some of these countries. You have these fat cats, everything's good, they're in control, right? But what Vince McMahon did is he went directly to the people, he went directly to the consumer and directly to the talent. He started buying out great talent, regardless of what promotion they were in, or regardless of what territory they were in, and he marketed directly to the consumer on a national basis. So no longer was the entertainment or this wrestling entertainment business local. It was now national. And when I think about Latin America, I kind of think about that. And America has had some authority in or some influence in this, but it's also been, for lack of better phrasing, a cultural restriction as well, where you have a situation where there never really has been this great unifying thought leader. Even the revolutions of Latin America aren't so much deep as the desire for independence in Latin America as it is with a reality of dealing with Napoleon in France and the consequences of some of his maneuvers. So you really have this much more of a hierarchical sense in Latin America, in contrast to the United States, which defiantly said no. And there was this commonality between we are American, you are British, this is the line. In Latin America, it says, well, this is our fiefdom. Everybody got their own, with some notable exceptions of wars, of course. Uh, but they're few and far between. Nowhere in contrast, despite the European roots of Latin America, they're nowhere near the amount of wars and conflict over territory in Latin America as they are in Europe historically. What you see here is these fiefdoms operator, and nobody has really gone directly to the people and in a meaningful way to say, we're turning this upside down. We're putting a flag before the culture, really. And that hasn't been a real threat. But with modern social media, this technology, a rise of a multipolar world, Latin America is more isolated. China's not as President Nicolas Maduro saw, China isn't coming over here to save the day. Russia isn't crossing the Pacific or the Atlantic to come save the day. You're kind of on your own. But the situation comes, and you're on your own against one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful country in the world that's going to want to seek to exert their influence at home, like any country would do. But it's only a matter of time before they respond in a more pragmatic way, because I think probably the closest historical precedent you can say is a person such as I would say Che Guevara. But and you see what happened to Che Guevara. So you see the situation where this creates this vacuum, and it's only a time before. What if another Latin country, such as Colombia, says, "Okay, no more America. You're operating here. You're completely ignoring international law. You're usurping our leaders." Because if you do this to Venezuela president, who's next in that line of the list? President Trump believes that way of thinking is going to provide him stability and security because other countries are going to be so scared. But it does provide an off chance that some other leaders say, you know what, to heck with it. I'll make my stand here while I still can. And then they side with Venezuela. So I'm really going to be looking at the news in Latin America to see where these countries are falling. How does Peru feel about this? How does Colombia feel about it? Big boys. How does Argentina and Brazil feel about this? So right now, it seems as though Maduro don't have a lot of friends in Latin America, at least from a military point of view. I think most of the world outside of the United States, which recognize this as real politics, most of the world was against the ousting of the president of Venezuela, but they haven't lifted a finger to do anything about it outside of just wagging that this is no good in an international order, by the way, that is subsidized by the United States. So that's a whole nother story. But really understanding further the Cuba connection to what just happened, and also understanding how is this over time going to start to play out as you see that VP Delcy Rodriguez is not on board. And if she is on board, maybe she's just a very crude politician and she says one thing to President Trump and Rubio and another thing to the people because President Trump's administration did not remove enough Maduro supporters from leadership. So if she's telling Trump that she's on board and going back to her country and saying she's not on board, that obviously means she don't feel enough security in Venezuela to assert American or represent American authority there. And that's because it hasn't been enough loyalists to Maduro removed from power yet. So I do believe, though, as long as the Cubans are in Venezuela, the United States is always going to have a hands up. I don't know if it's bad luck or what, but you can see what just happened in the current situation. So those are my thoughts. Love to hear yours. Please comment below, like, share, subscribe if you enjoy the content. Until next time, take care. Bantu up.